Season 2 of Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal has finally arrived, and true to form delivered a Conanian epic of gorgeous animation, heated pathos and indulgent violence, as Spear and Fang travel to a new continent to rescue Mira. In Season 1 we were first introduced to our main characters, Caveman Spear and Tyrannosaur Fang, when they bonded following the deaths of their families at the jaws of giant horned tyrannosaurs. After learning to work as a team, they took on mammoths, raptors, giant snakes, and a bat swarm in a symbiotic relationship with a giant spider, all across a prehistoric odyssey, and that's just the first half. After getting captured and almost killed by a gladiatorial group of apes, they face a rabid sauropod, a coven of shape-shifting witches, and a superpowered predatory dinosaur. In the final episode, they meet Mira, an escapee of a slave ship. They free her and the three form a close bond, before Mira is snatched away at the end of the season. If you haven't watched it already, maybe pause this and go and catch up, as Season 2 picks up right where it left off. Episode 1 starts with Spear going full spear and leaping right into the ocean after her. As you'd expect, this doesn't end successfully, and plan B is to build a raft, with Spear smashing down the trees lining the beach. With Fang's help, they have enough for a decent vessel by nightfall, and the next day the raft is ready for launch. Fang isn't impressed with this, but Spear remembers the grubs Mira used to lure her up the rock face the day prior, and before long the two have set sail, much to Fang's displeasure. What starts as an epic voyage quickly becomes a tiresome slog when they run out of waves, and the two have to take turns paddling. Their first day at sea ends and the two sail through a night of spectacles. Above them, shooting stars form an astral concert as they drift across starlight reflection, and beneath them a constellation of bioluminescent jellyfish arise to the ocean surface. A waxen moon in its reflection rises above and beneath them, and the two are woken by an oceanic ballad as whales swim below them and surface around the raft, serenading them with their songs. For a tyrannosaur especially, it's not unreasonable for them to pick up on whale song. As animals that likely communicated in very low frequencies, it's quite possible they could pick up on the messages. One record from naturalist Jonathan Scott describes elephants being transported from a zoo reacting to something in the ocean, and then a pod of whales breaching nearby. It could be that they picked up on the ultra-low frequencies of their communications. Fang and Spear are pretty freaked out by all of this, and rightly so. We're born into a society where animals often have fixed roles, and powerful, potentially intimidating animals like great apes and whales are painted as gentle giants, to be respected over feared. For someone who's never been at sea before and who's never thought of the concept of a whale before, it must be pretty terrifying. In the morning, Spear goes for a swim to assess their situation, and it seems he's also never been to the coast before. Only now does he really learn just how massive the ocean is, and how not good their situation is. With the heat of the midday sun beating down on them, things only seem to be going from bad to worse. Something surfaces nearby, and Spear leaps in, discovering it to be a giant sea turtle. The beast is massive, far larger than the largest turtle known to our world, Archelon. Neither Fang nor Spear have eaten for days, but both are pretty willing to sample turtle meat at this point. Spear attempts to grab it, but is shaken off, and almost eaten as a result. Whilst a lot of oceanic turtles we live with today are mainly herbivorous, prehistoric sea giants like Archelon and relatives may have been more like terrapins and snapping turtles, and had a protein-based diet with beaks well adapted to shear through flesh. In short, Spear is as much on the menu here as the turtle is for them. Its giant neck is too thick to choke out, and some tasks require a tyrannosaur's jaws to finish the job, and Spear brings the turtle to Fang. At last the two now both have some food and shade, and the odyssey continues. The raft approaches a storm, and panicked flying fish leap from the sea around them, pursued by predatory placoderms. As Fang and Spear eagerly fill the raft with fish, more predators are drawn to the bait. Pterosaurs dive from the sky, and appear to resemble giant relatives of Tropiognathus with their signature keeled bills. As one argues with Fang, a shark the size of a jumbo jet emerges from the swell and devours it, smashing the raft. Obviously, this is far larger than anything in our world. The largest estimates for Megalodon vary, but none are quite this large. Megalodon was one of the top predators of its age, and occupied the top trophic niche, eating other tertiary consumers like whales and other sharks. In the world of Primal, things are likely the same, just on a far larger scale. With pods of whales and supersized turtles encountered so far, the shark is clearly in good company for a meal. What might give it stomachache is a plucky caveman and his dinosaur. As the shark attempts to swallow both Spear and Fang, Spear manages to blind it, repelling the beast. The shark is dealt with, but the storm swells around them, and the two are tumbled and separated in the waves. Fang later wakes on the shoreline alone. So episode 2 opens with a dejected Fang deciding to head inland. And after a false start thinking she'd found Spear, she instead runs into something very unexpected. A male tyrannosaur. He's red-headed and plainer in colour otherwise, with a small array of horns on the back of the neck and a raised bump on the snout. As he eyes Fang up, further down the coast, Spear is swept ashore and uncovered by the locals. Meanwhile, Fang launches an ambush on an Arsinoitherium, a prehistoric and very distant relative to elephants. Reaching a clearing to defend itself, it may have been quite the struggle, if Red didn't attack at the same time, and the herbivore is quickly taken down. After some tug of war, Red relents and leaves Fang to it, but she shares the carcass with him, much as she did when her and Spear initially began to bond too. It's interesting that the male is horned in Fang's species. Large theropods had robust skulls, often with rugose protrusions, and may well have been suited for some head-to-head combat, but this also has some suggestions for the world of Primal too. The giant horned tyrannosaur in the first episode may have been the father over the mother to a brood of brothers. The notion of a jacana or cassowary rex, with the male taking care of the young, also isn't unheard of in recent depictions of tyrannosaurs either. Spear wakes, covered in something that isn't mud. In pain from a dislocated shoulder, he's startled by the one-eyed healer of the village and panics. As he rushes through the village, it appears to be a Celtic settlement, and despite his typically incredible physical ability, he's soon cornered. The chief appears unarmed. He offers water and food, and Spear finally drops his guard, with the chief winning one of Spear's smiles. Fang and Red head to a nearby fruiting tree, and Red appears to attempt some courtship, but Fang isn't quite sold just yet. The two begin to snack on fruit, established as an occasional treat for Fang in the first season, and it seems this species of tyrannosaur isn't adverse to frugivory. Much of the fruit has begun to rot considerably, and the pair get quite drunk from the feast. This may not be unintentional. Birds will readily eat rotting fruit, and ethanol has a much greater calorific value than just carbohydrates, almost double that. It can come with some side effects, and as well as the usual loss of coordination, birds getting drunk can affect mating and singing behaviour as well. So maybe in Fang and Red's species, frugivory is something of a nutritional shortcut to get some extra cheap calories in without the energetic expense of hunting, especially when rotting fruit provides more bang for your buck, quite literally as it later turns out. After a romantic woodland walk and chasing fireflies on the beach, the two seem to have established something of a pair bond. Back in the village, they have a round 2 at healing Spear's arm. The methods definitely seem questionable by today's standards, but luckily Spear is given some pain relief in that he's magically drugged unconscious. When he awakes, mostly healed, he joins the group in a meal. The chief's daughter attempts to strike up a friendship with Spear, but it doesn't go well, and he only isolates himself. Later that night, Spear finds one of the wolfish village dogs, and after some initial hostility, finds much more comfort in sharing a meal with it instead. And this episode is an important moment for Spear and Fang's characters. At the end of the day, Fang is still a wild animal, and one that may live a mostly solitary life. After the initial grief of losing Spear, she's effectively adjusted to life without him, having gone back to how she lived before. In contrast, Spear can't simply go back. The loss of his family has left him alone, and even with other people, it's not quite as simple as just slotting yourself back into someone else's family. Even if we ignore whatever effects how many months without human contact may do to your mind and socializing skills. Spear is from an entirely different culture and maybe even species, with no translator between them to help. He struggles to find comfort with people due to their differences, from his social missteps and being unable to express himself, and so in the end he finds comfort with animals instead. So really, Spear needs Fang much more than vice versa, and the importance of finding Mira, the only other person to break into that duo, becomes all the more apparent. The next morning, Fang and Red set out on a hunt, right into the Celtic village. Spear and Fang are shocked to see one another, and Fang is torn. She tries to keep the two apart as Red tries to hunt and Spear tries to keep the village safe. In the conflict, she's knocked unconscious and the fight becomes vicious, with Red on the brink of killing Spear. But before he can, Fang kicks him away and he falls onto a wooden stake snapped in the fighting. Fang watches as her new mate dies, and this is another establishing moment in the difficulty of reconciling Spear and Fang and their partnership with a human culture. Bringing a giant carnivorous dinosaur and a caveman not fluent in the language is a challenge for anyone, and it's easy for someone to get hurt if things escalate. The unique partnership that's kept them safe for so long now just isolates them from other people, and really they only have each other. Episode 3 opens with the two feeling a bit raw over the previous events. After some reconciliation, they both decide to seek shelter from the rain, and as Fang sleeps, Spear goes to explore the rest of the cave, and is shocked by what he finds. A vast chamber of cave paintings, showing both Mesozoic and Cenozoic fauna. One wall shows theropods and pterosaurs in contact with man. The others Pleistocene mammals like mammoths and elk being hunted. Finally, Spear sees some handprints on the wall. Whoever these people are, Spear empathizes with them. We'll never know the exact reasons for such cave paintings. Maybe they're visual aids to the stories of their greatest hunts and adventures, or perhaps they're drawn up before such events as plans. Maybe they're just art, done for fun, to show the world that you were there. As Spear did with his family back in the first season. Spear sees their messages, and even without meeting them, he can still make contact with some small part of what they've left, and the knowledge that in some way they're like him. The next morning, Fang is still a little frosty, so Spear goes for a lonesome walk. He emerges from the trees onto a rolling steppe, and sees great herds of Ice Age fauna. He sees a herd of Megaloceros, one of the largest cervids ever, and has a vision of the people who left the cave painting hunting them. He sees a herd of longhorned bison, one of the largest ungulates ever, and the largest ever to grace North America. Eventually he finds the village of the cave painters, and has another vision of their lives. The village is ransacked, and precious items like a carved wooden mammoth have been abandoned. Clearly this was not just someone moving house. Spear grabs breakfast and heads back to the cave. That night Spear notices the moon, and after remembering how it goes, makes a sheepish attempt at Mira's old prayer. Spear really has no leads at this point, but is desperate for any help or sign, and as established, is also pretty desperate to get her back as his only other companion who's an actual hominid and isn't terrified of Fang. He looks to the moon for guidance and receives nothing. All it takes is for a tiny owl to mock him before the last of his confidence fails, and he heads back inside. He doesn't get long to rest though before they're disturbed, and the two are joined in the cave by a Viking atop a great bear. From the size alone, this is likely Arctodus, also known as the giant short-faced bear. This was the largest bear known, and perhaps the most ideal one for mounted cavalry. Unlike other bears, it had adaptations for cursorial behaviour, and with its great stride length could probably cover more ground than any other bear, that and just being massive too. The bear and Fang have a roaring match so loud the roof begins to cave in and everyone flees. Fang and Spear now each have a mounted Viking to deal with, but they've faced worse before and quickly come out on top. One of the Vikings flees and leaves behind a shield with a sigil of the scorpion on it. At long last, this is their first lead. Just like with the deer, Spear shoots down the Viking, and attempts an interrogation that ultimately falls apart with Spear only knowing one word. Spear takes his sword and the two follow the scent trail. Finally, they're making more progress now than they have in days prior, and they find the Viking settlement. Inside, they finally find Mira, in a barn filled with other captives, and at last the trio is reunited. Everyone prepares to leave, but growls can be heard in the mist, and episode 4 opens with the cavalry returning. Bear cavalry are pretty cool, but just how feasible are they? Well, likely a lot more so than other giant carnivoran cavalry. They're intelligent and trainable, and if you're going to pick any giant Cenozoic predator as your mount, a bear may be the most economic choice. As generalist omnivores, bears can eat a lot of things, and this is already a big advantage over trying to make something like a creodont, mega wolf, or giant saber-tooth like He-Man's battle cat your mount. In some areas, bears can be almost entirely herbivorous, and other non-animal foods like acorns, other nuts and berries can also be very important seasonal foods for them. What's more, their adaptability means they can switch to other foods if one starts to fail, be it elk calves or truffles. Animal foods also aren't necessarily big ungulates either, and things like ants or moth caterpillars can be very important seasonal foods as well. The biggest bears, of which the Viking bear cavalry are, will need a good amount of meat though. Bigger bears need energetically valuable foods, and meat is often the best nutritional shortcut for it. So whilst even giant bears may be comparatively cheap as fantasy beast cavalry, they're still pretty expensive overall when you have 20 of them. Not to mention taxing on the ecosystem if you're just using forage and pillaging to get said meat. One current that runs through the notion of a lot of giant carnivorous cavalry is that it's very hard to achieve without ruining things for everyone else in the area, so it fits the Vikings perfectly. Their leader sees the stolen shield and puts 2 and 2 together, and he's furious. But as the cavalry advance, they're nervous. They can all smell Tyrannosaur, and no one wants to get close. As the leader forces his mount closer, Fang appears and falls through a roof. The leader charges but gets flattened quickly, and battle begins. As Mira leads the slaves free, Spear and Fang deal with the mounted Vikings. They've faced worse before, but this is still a more numerous, organised and well-armed foe. After the initial shock, the Vikings gain some ground, and manage to separate the two as well as summon the rest of the camp. Rika, their chieftainess, organises the Vikings and a shield wall surrounds Spear, as the surviving cavalry herd Fang into a tripwire. Spear is horrified to see children in the shield wall, and babies on their mother's breast among the warriors. Clearly for the Vikings it's never too early to weaponize the children, and Rika's own son rains arrows down on Spear from above. He breaks free and fights his way through the camp, as Rika confronts Fang herself, almost incapacitating her before Fang seizes Rika and ends her reign. Her son leaps onto Spear's back, and he flings him off, fatally striking his head on a rock. Spear is horrified at what he's just done, and reaches his breaking point. He climbs on Fang's back and abandons the fight, just trying to flee the village. But as they do so, a red mist descends on the camp. The two get lost and the Vikings catch up. Cornered against the cliffs and buildings, showered with arrows and with no way out, Spear and Fang leave no survivors. In a scene reminiscent of Spear's family first getting eaten by the horned tyrannosaurs, they slaughter the entirety of the village. As the red mist begins to clear, the chief returns with his son Eldar and a fresh catch of slaves. It should be noted too that in our own world, Vikings were notorious slavers as well. that likely resulted in other cultures giving them such monstrous depictions. Straight away on landing, they see something is wrong. A blood trail from the village and a stolen boat show that much. Heading up to their home, they find it destroyed, with their countrymen eviscerated and left for the crows. The chief finds Rika where Fang left her, and Eldar brings his younger brother. Now all they have left are each other, as they bury their clanmates and give Rika and her son a Viking funeral. This is the great consequence of their actions. You can't enslave and murder forever without someone pushing back, and for the Vikings that someone wiped them off the face of the earth as retribution. Each life they ended or captured was repaid wholesale by the law of spear and fang. But giving up is not the Viking way, and the two armour up, free the slaves, and prepare for their own vengeance. Episode 5 takes a bit of a handbrake turn with things, and we actually find ourselves in Victorian England. A group of early scientists have been gathered by what appears to be a young alternate universe Charles Darwin for a discussion of his latest theory. After making that whole boring natural selection thing, and its equally dry sexual selection sequel, he's decided to make things cool and kick things up a notch, and makes the Primal Theory, essentially arguing that under great emotional duress, humans can revert back to primal behaviours to defend themselves. Charles gets pretty lambasted for this by his stuffy colleagues, but before the roast can continue, they're interrupted by the local police, warning them of an escaped lunatic. After just doubling down on the banter, a storm interrupts them, and this turns out to be said lunatic killing one of the house staff, who then proceeds to go through several other scientists pretty quickly as well. Attitudes to mental health in this era can hardly be described as woke, but the patient in question definitely looks a little far gone. Skin grey and tattooed with sigils of death, his teeth filed to points to better consume human flesh. He definitely looks like he's not the type to submit to therapy. What begins is a two-way manhunt, with Charles, Blakely and Darlington arming themselves to hunt down the patient. Blakely gets knocked out pretty quickly, and the patient toys with Charles and Darlington before his next attack. Darlington manages to hold it off as the former boxing champion of Oxford, before they're almost overwhelmed and the fight proceeds to the greenhouse. As a tree falls through the glass, Darlington goes full spear, attacking shirtless with bone and spear, eventually succeeding in impaling the patient through the head, much to Charles's delight that his theory has been proven.
And there you have it!
In our own world at least, Charles's Primal Theory isn't one that really achieved the same foothold in published literature today, but it is very similar to the notion of hysterical strength. This is effectively the explanation of how people achieve incredible feats of power, like lifting cars off children in emergencies. As you'd expect, it's pretty hard to study, as you can't just replicate such circumstances safely in experimental design, so it relies more on anecdotes. But some studies do show that adrenaline can have an effect on muscle tissue and prevent muscle fatigue. This is the closest notion we have to the Primal Theory, and some scientific explanation behind hysterical strength. And it seems in this universe, this is the intended explanation behind the madness of Spear's incredible abilities, as well as those of other characters. It all comes back to the Primal Theory. Back in the past, Mira heals Spear and Fang's wounds, and the three take a moment to be together again. Fang smells something suspicious on the breeze, and everyone prepares for combat. The chieftain and Eldar have found them, and begin their assault. For the first time, Spear gets a worthy human opponent, and the chief is every bit as strong and skilled in combat as him. Clad head to toe in iron armour and wielding a great axe, he's also better equipped to tank damage and has far better reach. It's speed versus armour as the two fight. Eldar showers Fang and Mira with arrows, but he's no match for the dinosaur when she knocks him free from the crow's nest. The chief abandons his fight with Spear to rescue his son, and the ships crash into the rocks as the current sweeps them downstream. They only have the Vikings' boat left now, and it's only Mira's quick steering that prevents them all from being cast into the river, as the combatants are flung about by the current. Fang flings Eldar overboard, His father leaps in after him and their boat is ripped open by the rocks. The remaining trio manage to land the boat before it can sink. But no sooner are they on land than Fang begins acting strangely. She runs all over the place and then digs a shallow trench. When she lines it with some leaves, it all twigs for Spear that she's gravid. He instantly appoints himself uncle and helps with the nest building. And Mira also seems pretty happy with this development. Further up the river, the chieftain pulls his son free. Despite being dressed in full plate armor, he's managed not to drown, which is testament to his strength and endurance. He bandages his son's wounds and makes a fire for the two, and as he drifts off, he sees a giant horned figure that looms over him from the flames. He wakes with a start, and luckily it all seems to have been just a dream. Eldar comes back with a deer for breakfast, and as they eat, the chieftain remembers happier times, of meals with family at home as the children played. He's moved to tears by his grief, but it's pretty important to remember that just on the other side of these walls are entire buildings full of people who will also never experience a feeling like this again, directly due to the actions of the chieftain and his family, so by all means have the tiniest violin possible. As the chief goes to be alone with his grief, Eldar follows to comfort him, but both are distracted by a giant bird flying overhead to its conspicuous cliff-top nest. Back at camp, Fang lays her clutch, maybe in a bit too much detail, as Spear and Mira look on in delight at a healthy birth. Happy as Spear may be, this is just another reminder that Fang is still a wild animal, and company is when she wants it. Not even Spear is allowed to touch her eggs. Meanwhile, Eldar and the chief have scaled the cliff face. The two look to one another and both speak the word
Vidarr. Vidarr.
Which is also the episode title. Vidarr is a Norse god, and one of the sons of Odin. He's most typically associated with revenge, because Odin is killed by the giant wolf Fenrir, and it's Vidarr who avenges his father's death at Ragnarok by killing the wolf himself. In some iterations he runs his sword through Fenrir's heart, in others he literally tears open his jaws in true King Kong fashion. As such, he's typically associated with vengeance, and so the chief's goal becomes clear. Eldar leaps right off the rock face onto the back of a giant vulture, and the chieftain climbs to the roost to acquire a mount for himself. Giant carnivorous birds are a staple of pulp adventure literature, and deliberately invoke real-world allegories to a sense of untainted mystery of forbidden islands, due to bird species like the moa and elephant bird, that came from island gigantism in far-off lands. These birds more resemble giant vultures, although with such huge heads and necks they do somewhat resemble winged forest rakids too. Being a giant aerial scavenger also isn't so far-fetched. Of course, these animals could never fly in real life, but biological modelling suggests flight is the most efficient mode of transport for scavengers, due to how cheap it is and how it's also the best way to find carrion, and especially with soaring flight as vultures use. What's more, being bigger is better for scavengers as you can take much larger meals, and thus better utilise the carrion on offer. Obviously this comes with a point of diminishing returns, where you have more weight to lift and volant animals can only get so large. But if giant scavengers are to exist in fiction, they're most likely to be volant animals. Back at the nest, Spear has gone full uncle mode, as he brings back armfuls of fish, and Mira fixes the boat. But they don't have long to play happy family until the Vikings attack. Mira is snatched, and Fang is unwilling to leave the nest. Eldar tries to drop Mira to her death, but she's not so easily gotten rid of, and the two wrestle for control of the vulture, as it does everything it can to throw them off. Spear attempts to steal the chief's vulture and set off in pursuit, but a similar struggle erupts on the back of their bird. Mira is cut free but lands on with Spear, who manages to kick the chief off. He luckily has a nice soft landing, and hits every tree on the way down. In primal physics, this is just the same as landing in a nice feather bed. Eldar, however, isn't so lucky, and the chief watches as Spear kicks his son to his death on the rocks below. Upon seeing his ruined corpse, the chief lets go. He has now lost the final member of the very family he tried to avenge, in a conflict that begins from his own bloodshed across the globe, and the river current simply sweeps him away. Episode 7 finds the chief in his final moments, slumped over a rock as the Valkyries descend for him. Valkyries suggests that the Viking settlement wasn't just reminiscent of the typical depictions of them. They are fully fledged Vikings, and they share a lot of the notions of Norse gods too, and that such gods canonically exist in Primal. The Valkyries guide those who have fallen well in battle to Odin's Valhalla, or Freya's Folkvang, where they await Ragnarok, with dozens of slaves from across the globe captured in bloody combat, as well as riding giant vultures and fighting tyrannosaurs. The chief has clearly earned his place at the side of the gods, perhaps more so than any other Viking. But other members of the Pantheon also have their own ideas, and before the Valkyries can carry him away, red gremlin-like demons drag him to the underworld. This matches many depictions of hell, with black volcanic rock and open magma flows. The chief sees the souls of the damned among the magma, dropped off by more gremlins, and the wind beckons him to a fantastical doorway atop an impossible stair. Through it lies the horned figure from his dreams. With its flaming eyes it shows the chief Eldar's soul, and makes it clear what he wants from the chief, the souls of Spear and Fang themselves. The chief has fallen to the duo once before, and the horned god makes sure it won't happen again by bestowing incredible powers on him, and the chief becomes a giant fire demon. Returning to the surface later, he burns constantly. He can walk across water by causing localized boiling, and can conjure flaming weapons at will with incredible destructive powers, and now he's on the hunt for Spear and Fang. The horned figure seems most likely to be Surtur, a Jotun in Norse mythology. He's a big player in Ragnarok, who carries a flaming sword to slay the gods and set the world ablaze. He also battles and destroys Freya, who is aligned with the Valkyries. And it's worth noting they didn't exactly seem shocked when the gremlins showed up to steal the chief. This may be a regular event of Surtur poaching Freya's potential subjects solely to spite them. Meanwhile, the boat is fixed, and Mira is pretty keen to get going, but Fang is pretty unwilling to leave the nest. With some cat-and-mouse 3D chess, Mira moves the nest onto the boat, and Fang seems to be okay with it. The three set sail at last, bound once again for Mira's home. But predictably, things go south quickly. At night, as Fang stretches, a shape appears on the horizon. Next morning, from the fog, a truly giant ship appears, the Colossaeus. It's so large it carries its own sub-vessels to transport troops, and the trio's ship is soon boarded. A cautious Fang takes her eggs into her mouth to protect and hide them, as we saw earlier in the episode. The men on board seem to be a mix of Egyptian and Roman. They wear Egyptian-like nemes, but have helmets like a Misa, Ribchester or Nijmegen helmets, typically used for Roman cavalry, as well as being partially reminiscent of the Anglo-Saxon Sutton Hoo helmet. Such armour pieces are expensive and ornate, believed to be typically reserved for royalty or high-ranking officials in formal displays, and likely not lethal martial combat. But also they were often used as death masks. It may be part of their culture that every fight is viewed to possibly be their last. They're armoured for death, and are such excellent soldiers as they don't fear it, being entirely willing to die for their queen and conquest. Similarly, nemes were reserved chiefly for pharaohs, the highest ruler of Egyptian society. Much like their ostentatious ship, this may be a display of wealth from this civilization, that their basic rank and file are ornamented with the armour typically reserved for royalty. Equipment aside though, Spear and Mira still go through them like a hot knife through butter, up until a second vessel boards, and Kamau with it. Kamau is a giant, at least 10 feet tall with strength exceeding that. He can slap Spear away like a gnat, suplex a tyrannosaur and stop an elephant's charge. With Spear knocked out, Fang finally steps in and kicks Kamau back, but he slaps the eggs right out of her mouth. 2 land safely in the nest, but the third smashes against the ship. Inside, a partially formed chick can be seen. Fang now attacks in earnest, and a vicious fight breaks out as the three try to take down Kamau, all while he absorbs bites, arrows and beatings. Just as it seems the trio may finally have him, their brawl is interrupted by the queen, Ima. It was all a distraction, and now she has the remaining 2 eggs. The trio are imprisoned, their ship burned, and Mira is once again in chains. We see the inside of the Colossaeus, and it's a floating palace. With multiple floors, pools and gardens, it's the definition of opulence and excess. Fang and Spear are placed in the cells, and surprisingly, so too is their greatest warrior when Kamau joins them there. Mira is placed with the other captive women from assorted families. The queen later makes a short visit to Spear and Fang. After expending a few of her men, she uses one of the eggs to test their relationship. Clearly, tyrannosaurs can be trained, and Spear is the one who understands the abstract concepts like the position of her arm indicating the intent for the egg, and he calms Fang. The 2 come as a pair, with Spear being the brain. Now she has this information and their weakness. Later, the 2 are now on board one of the sub-vessels with Kamau and the Queen's men. Arrows begin to pelt the outside, and as the vessel lands, the men charge. Spear and Fang are armed and ordered to do the same, and step into a battlefield the likes of which they've never seen. Beneath the walls of a Babylonian city, 2 armies clash. War elephants larger than any of our world advance, and they seem around the size of Paleoloxodon. Paleoloxodon namidicus, or the Asian straight-tusked elephant, is speculated to be possibly the largest elephant ever, and possibly the largest land mammal known to date. Whilst this isn't entirely conclusive, there's no doubt it was a massive animal, more akin to sauropod size than those of modern elephants. Whilst going extinct prior to the Holocene, this isn't the case in the world of Primal, where the giant bulls are used for the Babylonian war effort. The elephant's eyes also seem bloodshot, and ancient civilizations would often give alcohol to their elephants prior to fighting, to calm a jittery animal or enrage an already violent one even further. Elephants can be cautious animals, and some Dutch courage may well be required to help them fly into combat against a tyrannosaur on first sight, even if they dwarf it. But this isn't Spear and Fang's first rodeo against proboscideans, and it goes a lot better than their fight against the mammoths. With their combined might, agility and ingenuity, Kamau, Spear and Fang assist the Egyptians in overwhelming the Babylonian city, in a siege lasting an hour at most. After the battle is done, Ima arrives to inspect her latest victims. Despite their massive amounts of treasure, she's scarcely interested. Instead, Ima likes trophies. Taking a liking to the king's cheetah cub, she takes it for herself before ordering his death. We also now see why Kamau is in service to the queen. As reward for his skill in battle, he's allowed a brief moment of contact with his daughter Alma. But before a few minutes have passed, she's snatched away again. Fang's belligerence to the queen having her eggs also doesn't go unnoticed by Ima either. After she departs, we truly see Kamau for the broken and tortured man he is. Over the next few months, the Colossaeus sails around the coast of the known world, destroying civilization after civilization. The King Dynasty, the Latin Crusaders, and even a portion of the mighty Roman Empire are all devoured by the Colossaeus and its endless conquest. And on the front lines of every battle are Spear, Fang and Kamau as the vanguard. As reward for their combat, Spear, Fang and Kamau are allowed private access to one of the Colossaeus' pools to soak their wounds after battle. And we find out this becomes a regular routine for them, following struggle after struggle. When their own ship is boarded by what seems to be a medieval kingdom, against the new trio of Spear, Fang and Kamau, the invaders are simply slaughtered and their ship is left a scorched ruin. Later, we see the queen is entertained by the women of the captured civilizations dancing for her. She barely seems to pay attention to this performance, and it's almost certainly much more about power and humiliation than the show. She instructs an uncertain Mira to do the same, and gives her a quick demonstration when she hesitates, killing the medieval king as an afterthought. Mira then picks it up pretty quickly. Sometime later they reach a small village, hardly a rival empire, and they seem peaceful and generous. The army's arrival is met with open offerings of food rather than showerings of arrows. The queen orders Kamau to make his approach, and he desperately pretends to misunderstand, bringing back the offerings of food in the hope they'll satisfy Ima. There was never a chance. Reminding him of his hostage, she orders Kamau to kill them all with his bare hands. It's clear from his face and the copious perspiration that this has an incredible emotional and mental toll on Kamau. He marches steadily through the whole village like an unrelenting avatar of persecution, and leaves no survivors. We see Kamau is forced to be a monster, and he despises himself for it. All done to try and protect his daughter. After this slaughter, Spear snaps. He breaks free from his cage and releases Kamau too, but he stays put. Climbing the central tower, Spear is spotted by one of the women, and a fight breaks out. Spear disposes of the guards and the queen's big cat pretty easily. The fact this cub is now at least partially adult just shows how long this bloody tirade has been going on. The animal in question is unknown, and it seems cheetah-like but with shorter and more robust proportions. Perhaps something analogous to Miracinonyx, the American cheetah, that was a meatier prehistoric relative to today's cheetahs. Ima herself now joins the fight, and what she lacks in size she makes up for in incredible agility, easily able to dodge all of Spear's attacks whilst landing her own. Mira grabs the eggs and a mal and makes a run for it as Spear clears a path. But to add to the chaos, the eggs begin to hatch. The calls of her young bring Fang and then Kamau to the surface just in time for capture. Part 3 opens with Fang in chains, and Kamau commanded to deal the death blow to her. The queen has almost certainly been planning this since their capture. At numerous points she observed the difficulty in controlling Fang, and how that's impossible without Spear. No doubt she doesn't like the fact that he has a tyrannosaur and she doesn't, even if they're both her thralls. Fang's belligerence just makes her a nuisance, and now the queen has her own tyrannosaurs that can be trained. Warriors grow old and wounds accumulate, and it's likely that all of the queen's victims share a similar fate if they don't die in battle. But Fang's time is now. Kamau has a flashback to his own capture, and only now do we see the full extent of the torture the queen inflicts on him by forcing him to be her steel gauntlet. Kamau doesn't even swat spiders in his home, instead capturing them to be released outside. We see his community are a pacifist tribe, much like the one he was forced to massacre earlier, although everyone here is just as large and robust as Kamau. They live in grass huts and farm the land, and manage the great herds of quagga. Quagga were a partially striped subspecies of plain zebra, native to the Cape region of South Africa, and some of the suggestions for the loss of stripes include a cooler, drier climate. Zebra become less intensively striped with a more southerly range, and the prevailing theory for said stripes is to prevent biting flies, which are less of an issue in cooler, drier areas. So maybe this also sheds some light on why Kamau and his people are so massive. Among other reasons, it could be to help deal with lower ambient temperatures. So overall, they're a gentle people who live peaceful lives in harmony with the land. When the queen shows up, there's little effort to fight, and they try to submit and avoid bloodshed. But this isn't Ima's way, and several are killed. Kamau is enlisted as the queen's weapon when she takes his daughter hostage. Kamau reflects on all of this. His daughter is now never allowed to see him as anything more than a walking slaughterhouse. And where does this actually end? Is Kamau or his daughter ever really going to be free if they keep doing this? Not likely. And so Kamau makes a decision. He frees Fang and swings the axe at Ima instead. The throw misses, but it's enough to trigger the start of a rebellion as Spear and Fang leap into combat. The former tearing soldiers apart with her jaws, whilst Spear uses the power of weaponized cinder block. Kamau is able to free his daughter and flees below decks. The Queen attempts to kill Fang out of sheer spite, but Spear intervenes and the two face off. Meanwhile, Kamau and his daughter share a touching moment, as he can't quite believe that he has her back, and she makes it clear that she doesn't hold his forced crimes against him. On the lowest strata of the ship, Kamau discovers his people alive and enslaved, using their incredible strength to row the Colossaeus. Meanwhile, Ima manages to disarm Spear. Spear is fast and strong and tough, but she's even faster. One of Fang's chicks is wounded in the chaos, as the final few soldiers are being dispatched, and Mira and Spear decide it's time to escape. Seizing the chicks, they leap overboard and Fang follows. The Queen is furious to see that they've escaped, but is at least pleased to see that they'll be smashed by the oars. That is, until Kamau starts a revolt, and his people rise up and kill their Egyptian masters. The oars stop and the trio manage to board one of the sub-vessels and free all on board as well. Ima is furious, but she quickly has bigger problems when Kamau and the rest of the giants come to the top deck. The Queen commands the attack, but it was always going to be futile. The very traits that she once so valued in Kamau when she forced him to fight now make his approach unstoppable, and she's given an unceremonious death when he flings her overboard. Everyone reconciles following the fight, and Kamau and his people begin to head home, but not before spying the chieftain on the horizon, on a march across the ocean's very surface with a singular goal. In the opening of Echoes of Eternity, Spear has a memory of his childhood, or rather the end of it when he becomes a man. His father taught him cave painting, but a pride of saber-toothed cats find the cave and attack the tribe, killing several people. Spear's father entered his Primal Theory state, and with red eyes fights back, taking down several cats but ultimately falling in the process. Spear kills the remaining individuals and becomes chief himself, although he presumably leaves later to find and start his own family. In both serious and cartoonish paleoart, Machaerodont felids, which is the term usually used in the deep lore of real life, sometimes called paleontology, are typically portrayed as the chief enemy of cavemen and Neanderthals, and this isn't so far-fetched. From size alone and possibly their social behaviour, the cats most resemble Smilodon, which may well have been pride living as well as a contender for the largest felid ever. But in terms of hominid hunters, the earlier Machaerodont Meganterion, a Smilodon ancestor, was a likely suspect. Fossils of both old hominids and baboons in South African caves show evidence of predation, and C.K. Brain believed this to be Dinophilis, which he posited as something of a primate specialist, and indeed this was spread further with its portrayal in Walking with Beasts. But modern leopards and spotted hyenas, as well as Meganterion, were much more likely the ancient man-eaters of Swartkrans. Spear is woken by Mira, excitedly saying that they've made land, but upon reaching the shore she near instantly breaks down from the memories of her capture on this very beach. We see the chieftain and his men were personally responsible for her capture, and the murder of her friends and lover, as well as the details of her escape. As the rest of the squad make landfall too, and Fang's chicks have a brief swimming lesson, the group make their way inland. They pass through a stunning desert landscape similar to the Enedi Plateau, spooking herds of camels drinking in the gelters. That night, Spear joins Mira in her lunar prayer, and genuinely seems to get some comfort from it. Next morning, Fang drops the kids off with Spear and goes hunting, almost eating Mira's friend Amira. Luckily, Mira gets to the pool in time to save her, and after months apart, the two embrace. Amira is the first person of her original culture Mira has seen in weeks, and she has to explain the giant lizard monster and the loincloth-wearing man holding two smaller versions of it. They all make their way home, and Spear is impressed to actually see what a town looks like, having spent his life in caves. After some initial shock, Mira is reunited with both the rest of the town and her father too, who seems to be their leader. Mira may speak Arabic, but with the style of building and the mask dances they do, Her settlement seems to be most similar to the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa. Such dances hold key social importance among groups, and are approached with the proper etiquette. In the dance they hold that night, we again see that Spear doesn't really fit in here either. Things are no doubt going better than with the Celts, and Spear does seem to enjoy the performance, but he doesn't bow to the moon mask like everyone else, despite it being fairly obvious, and then wanders off halfway through to go and see Fang and the chicks. Mira comes to find him and shows him to his new room. He, Fang and the chicks spend their first night there, but Spear finds that something is missing, and he begins to make some cave art. The next morning, Mira finds that Spear has drawn his past, how he became a man after the Sabertooths, meeting his wife and having children, their deaths at the jaws of the horned tyrannosaurs, meeting Fang and the death of her chicks, meeting Mira, crossing the ocean and finally getting to the town. The final image is a picture of himself, almost like a signature on the work. We see Spear feels something is missing in his life, and prefers to spend time alone. It may be that everyone else gets to go back to where they started. Fang has 2 new chicks, and Mira is home with her people. But Spear has no mate or family or tribe here, and few things feel lonelier than being surrounded with people with no connection. Everyone else gets to move on and be happy again, except for Spear. Spear's loneliness is broken by a commotion in the town. The chieftain has returned. Spear and Fang are the first to confront him, and quickly find themselves in trouble as he conjures a flaming super axe and splits the very earth with it, as well as forging great sheets of fire. The duo climb a nearby cliff as the chieftain transforms into a giant snake in pursuit, but on reaching the top, they're cornered. The chief sets Fang ablaze first, and then Spear too. But Spear enters his own primal state, and leaps straight for the chieftain, knocking him from the cliff and slamming him against the rocks on the way down. At the bottom, the chieftain still seems keen for revenge, but the horned god isn't. A great hand snatches him back, turning him into a mere mortal once again. It's hard to say why the horned god ended his free trial of fire elementals so soon, but one factor could be that gods are just capricious. Unlike modern depictions of Christianity where it's all forgiveness and repentance, older pantheons of gods like Norse or Greek ones rarely cared much about humanity, often being completely fine with them being severe collateral damage for their own dramas. People were often pawns at best, and more just tried to appease gods rather than much else. The horned god's power could be purely to spite Freya, or just trying to get back at Spear and Fang for ending the whole slavery thing. That did seem to be up his alley. The fact that he doesn't seem especially concerned Fang survives does suggest that this was hardly important to them anyway. Spear is rushed to the town's healer, but there's little that can be done for such severe burns. The healer is abundantly aware of Spear's fate, and so are Fang and the chicks as they leave. Mira looks at Spear's story on the walls, and now sees that it's not a signature at the end. The final sole picture of Spear is his belief that this is the ending of his story, with him alone, so Mira decides to continue Spear's story. Years later we see their daughter, the perfect combination of both parents, riding atop a red-headed Rex with her father's spear as Mira and Fang look on in pride at Spear's legacy. Overall, Primal Season 2 was a wild ride. I'd be hesitant to call it as good as Season 1 for a handful of reasons though. There's definitely some misplaced priorities in the writing, and it feels like Episode 10 should have been a 2-parter, to fully allow the events to unfold in good time rather than the 3-part Colossaeus, which, whilst a nice story, got too much time compared to the more important beats in the story of the finale. I really would have liked another season of Fang and Spear, but at the same time their story really was over when Mira got back to her home, and I do actually think that Spear's death, but after having a child with Mira, was the most fitting conclusion for him, with the setup of the season showing he'd never quite fully recovered from the loss of his family, and he'd never truly fit in a civilized world. If Primal is an anthology series though, I hope we'll see them again. Considering other episodes and characters can take place at any time, it'd be nice to see them again in another character's season, or having a standalone episode of their own, as clearly a lot happened between various points of Season 1 episodes that we never saw. There's no way they can go from polar tundra to barren desert overnight. Surely the last image Tartakovsky gives us of Spear can't be him half roasted. I would also like more creatures again too. I did like the inclusion of more human civilizations, but if Season 2 was Conan the Barbarian, then Season 1 was Pellucidar, and I think a halfway point between the two would be nice. Overall, sad as I am to see the trio go, I'm still looking forward to what Tartakovsky does with Primal in the future. Once again, we'll be flying blind, and I'm still pretty excited for it. Thanks for watching. And a huge thanks to patrons Eringar Steiny, Phenomenon, Mentos, K Sandom, and Bazu Gazu Bachomatsu first time, for their generosity. A lot of my big non-Monster Hunter videos get demonetized, so if you can chip in on Patreon, it's always appreciated. If not, just sharing the channel and watching the videos with that whole liking and subscribing thing also helps out if you like what you see. If you haven't seen it already, I also covered Season 1 in a similar format. That video got a bit mangled by both Filmora and YouTube respectively. One more error or copyright strike and the whole thing was just going to be me talking over Test Card F for 50 minutes. But hopefully it's still watchable, and hopefully this delivered too. There were more cultures and less creatures, so it wasn't quite up my skill set as Season 1. But I hope this was still a worthwhile watch. As well as Season 1, if you're new to my channel, I also have a lot of other content to check out. Peter Jackson's Skull Island may be up your alley, and there's also assorted Spec Evo videos and various members of Monster Hunter's roster that I've covered too. With plenty more to come as well. Next video will be Naga Cougar, so hopefully I'll see you for some of them.